This is the Environmental Echo, brought to you by PW Grosser Consulting, and I am your host, Paul Boyce, President and CEO of PW Grosser. Today, we've got another exciting topic for you, and one that's really important to the region that we live and work in. That's going to be resiliency. We got two great guests. I've got Dr. Paul Grosser, the founder of PW Grosser Consulting, who is now our executive chairman of the board. He founded the firm about 30 years ago as a sole proprietor, and we have come such a long way since then, and it's been a great ride. I've also got Charlie Bartha again for the third time's the charm on the Environmental Echo here. He is a senior vice president with our engineering group. He's also a former commissioner of Suffolk County with the Department of Public Works. And I want to welcome both Paul and Charlie to the Environmental Echo. What I'd like to start off with for our listeners' benefit is, we bandy this topic or this word, this phrase around quite a bit. It really came into, its own, really, in my mind, after Superstorm Sandy, which was, October of 2012 or so? So we're going on, 9-10 years after the fact, after that storm, and there's still areas of the county and the island and the region, that are still affected by it. So can you guys just give me an overview of what resiliency is, what it means, what are we doing, where are we going with this? What is resiliency?
If you go to the dictionary and look at resiliency, it's the ability to bounce back, and that's what we're looking to do. It's the ability to withstand extreme events. And recover from them as rapidly as we can and afterwards. One of the things we have to remember is resiliency is not just about climate change. There's a whole load of things that can happen to us in this day and age that can impact what we do. There's cyber attacks, which you saw on the pipeline just a few weeks ago. There's terrorist attacks. There's just plain old system failures that happen. Stuff does happen in our world. Pandemic impacted the country, the world, and that also requires some resiliency. So it's a very broad area when you start talking about it, and it makes you have to look at everything we've done as far as engineers to see how they withstand some of these impacts. You do a design, and then you have to say, well, what happens if we freeze this thing, like they had, the loss of power in Texas.
Oh, yeah.
Due to the freeze. You can't have your own state just without any other connections to other electrical grids. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about in resiliency, how to bounce back from whatever hits you.
You can't always anticipate. You try to anticipate as much as possible, as Paul was alluding to, but there's things that just you can't. At the county, we used to have these desktop exercises from time to time that suppose there is a hurricane and there's a coincidental before the hurricane comes, there's a power failure. So there's a lot of things to consider, but by training and making as much infrastructure improvements as you can, gives you the versatility to be able to do that, to be able to be resilient and come back.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. You guys brought up a real good list of ideas or concepts, topics that would fall under, resiliency or how to be more resilient. Just like you said, the pandemic. I mean, that took us by storm, and we are still more or less not maybe in the real deep throes of it, but we're still in the midst of it, and trying to bounce back from that, and then again in the future, how do we prevent or how do we mitigate these things from happening, or just be better prepared for they don't spread so rapidly. That was great, and also terrorism and cyber terrorism now. You mentioned with the pipeline getting hacked and turning off a fuel supply to a region. We've seen, all of a sudden the price of gas goes up overnight, incredibly, or there's a real run on it. What are we doing regionally to make Long Island more resilient in the face of, it's always a hot topic, climate change, rising sea levels, storm surges, these more infrequent, powerful storms like, I mentioned Superstorm Sandy, or Charlie mentioned hurricanes. We get socked with those, every few years, and they seem like they're coming, faster and more furious and more often. What's the plan?
The focus right now is on protecting critical infrastructure. This is wastewater treatment plants, which are generally in low-lying areas by the shoreline, hospitals, which can be in those areas, power plants that are on the shoreline, those kind of things. So you want to the focus right now is, like I said, is protecting those, which is kind of like the low-hanging fruit. It's not a regional approach, but it's a very focused approach. So we can deal with things on the short term. Longer term issues are, do you start putting up floodgates different places? They do this in Europe. The Thames River in London has a floodgate. Rotterdam Harbor has a floodgate. Venice in Italy has floodgates. It's a little shaky on how they have a little problems with construction, a little problems with operation, but those things have to be worked out. Also, part of the key issues is having a plan on how you're going to react to an event. It may be evacuation, it may be shelter in place, but you've got to have that plan as you're designing the resiliency. Engineering-wise, it's got to be both an engineering and a planning process and a social process. A lot of the work we did for high-density housing in the Rockaways to protect those buildings against, I think there was a plan. You're going to protect the building, you're going to evacuate the building. As part of the evacuation of the building, you had to know the people in the building. So that it was a neighborhood type of approach. So they knew someone on the third floor was in a wheelchair and needed assistance in getting out, particularly if the elevators weren't working. Things like that. And how do you then enhance that sociability within that building? Do you have common areas where people can socialize and get to know their neighbors, and they get to know the effect of a storm and whether these people can sustain themselves, whether sheltering in place or evacuating. So it's all part of both engineering and socialization and planning that goes into this. It's not just an engineering solution.
You brought up something that never ever crossed my mind with this, the social aspect, like getting people together. It seems like it's getting more and more difficult in that respect with the internet and smartphones and iPads and everything else. Yeah. I just see it in our own office with the younger crowd, how they tend to socialize. Can it be done virtually, or does that, is it more difficult? Has anything like this been tried before?
I think that's really new on that. I think that still you're going to try for more and more socialization as you can, and like we talk around the office, it's the in-person contact that develops these things. It's not something that you can just develop
on a website,
on a website or virtually.
All those social media avenues certainly can get the message out, but whether you're going to get people to listen to it is everything has become quite polarized on every subject you can think of. So you got to get people to believe. And one of the big problems when I was at the county, people would be resistant to evacuating, whether it was Fire Island, where you're particularly vulnerable, or in the low-lying areas of the county.
Well, you just, Paul mentioned the evacuation. You just brought it up, and that was, as soon as you both said it, I'm like, okay, we have to have a plan to do this, right? But have we ever had like a dress rehearsal? Like back in school when we were kids, we'd have a fire drill. Everybody line up, we're getting out of the building, you're going to stand here until this is over, right? What? I mean, it's great. We're going to evacuate, but you know what happens? Everybody rushes for the one bridge at once, and it's mayhem. Do we have, obviously there's a plan, but have we tested the plan? I know you said desktop studies.
Yeah.
What do you do?
I don't think, I haven't seen that done. I haven't seen anyone try to implement it.
Nope, I don't think so. I think some of these high-rise apartment buildings in the city, I think the fire department does some dress rehearsals by just responding and, knowing where fire hydrants are and knowing ways to get out. We did programs for those places on what evacuation routes they should be taking, because that's the key aspect. You've got to know what the evacuation route is. We did work at Staten Island Hospital, and in that instance, when the water was at the doorstep, there was no way out. It became an island, and there was 8 feet of water all around the facility. So they had to have this plan. They had to know, are they going to evacuate, or are they going to shelter in place? And they've got to make that decision early. It's not like you can wait and say, uh-oh, it's coming in the front door, let's get out of here. And particularly when you've got patients and things like that where it require a lot of advanced planning to move. So big planning aspect to that, and knowing what that evacuation route is, at least have people aware of it and knowing how to go. We did a plan for Good Sam Hospital where the original plan was to be able to shelter in place and keep operational. And we essentially had a barrier around the whole campus. And the intent was to be able to get cars in from Montauk Highway so you could actually continue operation of the hospital during an extreme event. The wall did not go over very well with the town.
I remember.
For aesthetic reasons. So we changed the plan. We said, okay, we're going to do a smaller wall designed to a less extreme storm, but we're going to have to evacuate to do that. So there's an evacuation plan now in place as part of that structures going in to protect the hospital. So now it's protect the hospital, evacuate the hospital, but be able to return to a fully functional hospital when the event's over.
And that is one of the interesting things of what good engineers do is they react. They don't get locked into one solution. You have to be creative and see what other solutions there are, taking into account other considerations, and in this case, the community.
Oh, and there's a lot of contingencies, but I forgot where it was either quoted by somebody or I read it. It was some military phrase. It's not the plan that failed, but the failure to plan, right? And I think that may apply here, but I'm still always leery about mass evacuations. You see them in Florida when the hurricanes come, and they're all all on one road that's just a big jumble of cars, and same thing over here on Long Island where it's a very densely populated area. We do have roadways, you can see at rush hour, it doesn't seem like we have nearly enough roadways. You try to go through that Oakdale merge at 5 o'clock any night of the week, and you want to pull your hair out.
And then you always have the people that just refuse to evacuate no matter what circumstances.
That's correct.
And that jeopardizes the first responders and the emergency people.
Absolutely correct. And again, that was something you saw in Superstorm Sandy. You looked at like areas of Queens that caught fire, and then, people had to come and rescue them, and you got to put yourself at risk to, or maybe unnecessary risk to help save someone. So it's again very, very critical and very, very crucial. That's why in my mind, it's great to have a plan, but I want to make sure the plan's going to work.
Right.
So kind of like I said when we were kids.
Yeah.
Fire alarm goes off. Yeah. We all get out of the building.
Well,
right?
The mass evacuations are always difficult, particularly on barrier islands.
Yeah.
You have a hardy group of people who said, I've ridden out hurricanes before, and I can ride out this one. And they don't know what this one is. There's a big difference between a Category 1 and a Category 3. And they don't necessarily want to follow instructions.
And do you think that these Categories 1s, 2s, 3s, are they getting more severe? So is like a Category 1 like a thing of the past, or is it? There'll always be smaller scale storms, but are the bigger scale storms going to be, whatever the next category is, 6, 7, or are we due for something like that?
I think when they do the analysis for Long Island, they don't see those type of storms hitting here. They just kind of run out of gas, getting over cooler water. As that water warms up, you might see some Category 3s, which you hadn't seen in the past. So you're going to probably see some more intense storms. And the thing that is really concerning is these storms come and they'll end up stalling. Sandy did that. It stalled. And usually, a hurricane will pass through in, 6 hours maybe. So it passes relatively quickly normally. Sandy sat there for 2 days, a number of tidal cycles. So it just compounds the flooding issue. You think you're out of it, and then it comes back, right, with more of a vengeance. So you're concerned with that. I think it was Hurricane Irma in the Bahamas, sat there for 2 days, right, over Grand Bahama Island, and just ravaged the place, and you just couldn't get away from it. So there wasn't any breathing room. So we're seeing more and more of that. We saw, Harvey went and stalled over Houston, right, and dumped a ton of rain, which they weren't prepared for. So more concerned with planning for the duration of the storm, where we used to think it was kind of like one and done. Now it just kind of can sit there for a while.
You also mentioned wastewater. Generally wastewater treatment plants, engineering 101, shit flows downhill, right? So you want to put it at the bottom of the hill. which is generally down by the bay, down by the coast someplace,
Right.
you know, they're, you know, right in the wake or right in the way of whatever, tidal surge, storm and wave action, you know, rising sea level. What are we doing at these places? Obviously, we're not going to move a sewage treatment plant inland. At least I don't think we are at this point. I mean, maybe we won't have a choice in the future, or maybe we'll have a whole different type of technology at that point. But right now, what are we doing to make our wastewater treatment plants more resilient here in Long Island?
Well, I mean, there are a number of things. First, think about the problem they had in Japan with the nuclear power plant failure, where they basically had the generator in the basement. So they lost power for one of the simple aspects of the facility, which led to the whole catastrophic failure. So those kind of areas, the power generating at treatment plants are being protected. They have, and you also basically abandon the idea of treating the sewage during a very major storm. And when I was commissioner, there was an instance of and the treatment plant was designed for 30 million gallons a day, the Bergen Point treatment plant. We had a tremendous storm. We were passing 90 million gallons a day through that plant. We had so much water coming in. And part of the problem was you have people will open, they're trying to relieve flooding in the street, and they open the sanitary sewer. So now you have a tremendous amount of water going through the system. So the water that was passing through the plant wasn't typical sewage. It was watered down, but still something you try to avoid. So I think the county has been installing more waterproof manhole covers to keep the water out of the system, locking covers. I mentioned earlier about when we were installing the sewers, elevation 3.5 had been selected as the flood level. So anything 3.5 or below, which was actually a pretty good part of the sewer district, was watertight manhole covers. But now you see it's at much higher elevations. You have to be concerned. And Paul, you were involved in this more than myself on the resiliency projects that we did. But like fixing the height of the wall is something important, and the basis for that, you know, be interesting to hear, as well as something that lay people don't think about, is that you build a wall to protect a facility, but you still have all that rain coming down. Now it's impounded inside the wall, so you've got to be prepared to get rid of that as well.
Yeah, on the flood elevations, what's unique is in the past we always looked at the past was going to represent the future. So we said, you know, whatever we've seen in the past is going to continue into the future. Well, that we can throw out the window now with the climate change. So we're seeing increased intensity of storms, increased flood levels. So what used to be the 100-year storm may be the 50-year storm now. So, and then the question is, how do we predict into the future? Do we just take a straight line and say, okay, this is where it's going, or is it going to increase exponentially, or is it going to level off at some point? We really don't know. So there's a lot of projections being made by a lot of scientists around the world on sea level rise, temperature changes, and everything else, with a whole slew of different models. So we kind of look at those. And also, we did some modeling of our own from models that are out there that model storm surge on Long Island, in the New York Bight, and areas like that, to see what they would show us. So we did kind of a sensitivity analysis at looking at all these different things, and looking at, you know, what Sandy provided. And we came up with originally a flood elevation of 10 feet, which is pretty significant. And when we revised it to change the plan, we revised it down to 8 feet. Now the code for FEMA for hospitals is a recommendation of the 500-year storm. So the 8 feet was still a little bit above or about the same as the 500-year storm. So FEMA was okay with us designing the system to that so it could be funded by the federal government. So that was the good thing. It was still in there. But, you know, designing to code is no longer going to be the way it's done in these particularly in critical infrastructure situations. You're going to have to look at the code, and that's kind of going to be a guide. You don't want to be less than code, but you're going to have to say, okay, is code adequate for this? And then what Charlie brought out before is you want to avoid these catastrophic failures. You don't want to design something so if for some reason you get a storm that's greater than the storm you designed for, the whole system collapses.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's got to be strong enough and robust enough so if the wall gets overtopped, you still can deal with it, and you're not going to have a collapse of the wall. You know, the levee failure in Katrina,
yep.
was a classic example of where they designed for a 100-year storm, and exactly a 100-year storm. And when they had greater than a 100-year storm and the water came over the levee, it eroded behind the levee because they didn't protect behind the levee because it was only going to be funded for a 100-year storm. And then the levee failed. And that literally killed hundreds of people and flooded out a whole neighborhood. And then you talk about, you know, social justice and things like that, which is coming into play these days. This was a very low-income a minority neighborhood, devastated. Just people were on the roofs of their homes and cutting through the roofs of their homes because they were in the attic to get out and to get saved. It's a horrible situation. So we've got to be cognizant of those things as we design in the future.
Essentially, you need a way to triage and allow some of the water to pass in a situation like that. It's like a bypass of a dam or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, something else it's always on my mind. You know, we're on Long Island. We've got barrier islands, right? And during Sandy, we had breaches of those islands. You know, so in my mind, also, it's always been a temporary structure out there. Hopefully, temporary is long after I'm gone, but we'll see. You know, what happens when we have a breach? You know, I mean, those barrier islands, you know, we don't want our bayfront properties to be oceanfront property. Mm-hmm. They're not designed for it. You know, I've got family that live right on the Great South Bay. They've had to rebuild their bulkhead a number of times already due to storms and, you know, a bunch of other reasons, but it seems like it's more and more frequent. You know, I know that the one breach we had out, it's kind of out by Smith's Point in that neighborhood. What's it called? Old Inlet now.
Old Inlet.
You know, and it hasn't been filled in. It hasn't naturally filled in yet or anything. It's just there. I mean, it's been great improvement for water quality in that area of the bay. But, you know, what do we do about breaches? Is there a way to make it so it doesn't happen? Or do we want these things to happen? What's the thought process with the barrier island for resiliency?
It's going to happen. You know, you look at barrier islands on Long Island, you look at barrier islands literally around the world. These things are temporary. They're always moving in geologic time. You know, it might not be in one or two people's lifetime. There were breaches, you know, inlets through Fire Island and through Jones Island in the past. You know, there used to be an inlet at Gilgo. These inlets come and go. Moriches Inlet came about in the hurricane of '38. So these things come and go, and it's a natural process. Fighting Mother Nature can become real difficult at times, so you're going to have to live with some of it. The problem comes in, you know, the breach at Old Inlet was in an unoccupied part of the island, so that had happened. You know, the only people that interrupted was the people who drove down the beach from Smith's Point to get to Davis Park or something like that. But there was no road there. So there wasn't any infrastructure at all, so it really wasn't that big a deal. But when you get into a community like Ocean Beach or something like that, if you're going to get a breakthrough there, there's a large economic impact on that. And that's where we got to make some decisions as to, you know, how we're going to deal with it.
You know, money aside, is there anything that can be done to stop a breach? If, you know, the ocean says, I'm coming through here, I mean, it's not like we could build a giant seawall around the...
Well, seawalls.
It's a big problem because we want things to stay the way they are. And as Paul said, this has evolved, and it would continue to evolve if we didn't intercede with jetties and that kind of thing. You know, the natural movement of the sand. And every solution has its set of problems with it once you try to work with that. I mean, I often have thought that some sort of system offshore to break the waves would be good. That wouldn't make a surfer like you happy.
Well, it depends. It depends. But I mean, you brought up a good point. These like living shorelines and all these new, you know, I don't want to say new, but these ideas and these technologies. Is there any merit to those here on Long Island?
I think there are, my son's, exploring coral, development of coral reefs as offshore. I think it's not necessarily on Long Island, but in other places, particularly down in Florida and things like that, where they can get a good growth of coral and develop these offshore bars, essentially, or reefs to protect the shoreline. It breaks the wave action. So that's significant. You can also do it with some structures, concrete structures and things like that, not a wall per se, but these triads or whatever they're called. You dump a bunch of them out there to create a reef, and then let nature take its course as well, because that'll develop, oysters or whatever, marine growth on them, which helps to develop the reef. So they use it as a substrate.
And that legitimately helps with the storms or tidal surge, storm surge,
Well,
and wave action.
It helps with the wave action, which is really the big thing that erodes beaches. It will not, if you've got 9 foot of tidal surge, it's going to be 9 feet high no matter what you put there. Same thing we're talking about with the marshland in the bay. It is good for breaking wave action and making things shallower, and so you don't get large waves hitting your relative's bulkhead there. But if you've got 9 feet of storm surge, it's still going to be underwater, and it doesn't prevent that.
Something that's been done recently, the last 10, 20 years, in collaboration of the towns and the county in Suffolk, is if you go back to I think it was 1991, there was a small breach along Dune Road in what is West Hampton Dunes now, which cut off access to Cupsog, a major county asset. So for a couple of years, people couldn't get to the beach. What started out as a very small breach grew to well over 1,000 feet.
Whoa.
So it cost a lot more to stabilize when they finally got to it. But now the county and town, they store sand so that they can react quickly if there is a small breach, and they have done that. Out towards Shinnecock, it's been done a couple of times.
Yeah, Robert Moses was known for having the bulldozers ready during the storm to fill in any breach that happened along Jones Beach.
I remember right after Sandy, over there on like Jones Island too. I mean, the trucks, they got them down there, the contractors, everybody, and they rebuilt that dune very quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, we understand the beaches are a big part of our tourism and the economy here on Long Island, especially this time of year. It's the middle of August. It's hot. We all want to go. We do appreciate them, and I got to say we need them.
Yeah. Well, the breakthrough that you were talking about before, Old Inlet, that's particularly interesting because of the fact it didn't impact anybody. It was allowed to remain open, and that's been a real positive asset, from what I understand, both keeping the water clean, having more species of fish in there.
Is it navigable? Can people get boats in and out of there? I mean, I've heard it's not the best.
It's not officially navigable. I think if you have a small boat and you know what you're doing, you can do it. People do it, but I don't try.
All right. Yeah, no, I don't know if I've even paddled my surfboard out through there.
I swam through the breach out at Cupsog.
Oh, wow. Very interesting. So, we talked about some of the structural ways to address some of these resiliency issues. What about procedurally? Again, we talked about evacuation plans. Is there anything else, like, what happens after something like this hits? I just mentioned somehow, the state of New York, we got dump trucks rolling like within, I don't want to say hours, but days after Sandy hit. What's being done in terms of, bigger regional scale plans? Any idea?
Not particular. I think DPW and the counties have, and the city has emergency plans in place, how to get fuel supplies in, keep lines going as they can.
And shared
food.
equipment agreements which don't work all that well for normal situations, but for storms, very cooperative, the different counties in the state. On snowstorms, the state has sent a lot of equipment down to help out the counties.
And you see with the power failures, all of a sudden you'll see some trucks from Michigan or some things like that where they have these agreements with other power companies around the country.
That was going to be my next topic to throw out there, was going to be, the regional power grid. We saw the devastation that thing sustained during Superstorm Sandy, and even last summer, with Isis or whatever that storm was, or hurricane. What's being done? Are we making any improvements? Are we hardening that? I mean, everyone
Well-
says you got to bury it, you got to bury it, you got to bury it, and obviously that costs a lot of money, you know. And
You see a lot of
who's going to pay for that? The ratepayer?
Yeah, well, that's a big problem, and you see a lot of tree pruning going on.
Yeah.
To make that situation better. I know you go inland. Like my daughter lives in Pittsburgh. They don't have power outages from lines going down, and I'm not sure why that is. But here, obviously, we do, and the tree trimming is so important. So that's a big one.
And every once in a while, we get an ice storm where you
Yeah.
get big buildup
Right.
of ice on the
Yeah.
wire, and it brings it down.
But think about how tied we are to our cars and the move to electric cars now. What's going to happen if we don't have electricity for a week?
Everyone's going to need solar with some kind of battery backup, right? You need
Yeah.
redundancy,
Yeah.
part of the resiliency.
Yeah.
But everything costs money.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and you have backup generators, so more and more people will be buying
Yep.
backup generators for their homes, and they'll be able to plug in their car, and it's kind of like each individual home will have its own resiliency
Yeah.
issues on how to deal with this.
That's what you need. And even with the low pressure sewer systems we've been dealing with, you need each home should really have their own generator.
Yeah.
That's like people like ourselves, since we're familiar with that kind of equipment, it's not a big deal to make that connection. For other people, it is a big deal, unless you do a more expensive installation where it's an automatic transfer.
Right.
So again, it costs money. But how much protection do we need? That's what it comes down to. And how much patience
Charlie,
do we
I
have?
got to be air conditioned. All right? I mean, I can't live like that anymore.
And for some people, it is a health issue.
Yeah.
People who
that's right.
actually need the air conditioning to survive, or need the heat. So people who are, I would say compromised, but the elderly in general
Absolutely.
need some of that protection.
You have
Otherwise
people
they-
on oxygen.
Oxygen
Right.
for one, 100%.
Right. So we've got to look at the whole spectrum of society when we do these designs on who the vulnerable people are and protect them. And that's where Charlie talked about triage. That's where you're going for the protection. Have shelters for those people. Know who they are so you can get them to the shelter. Because they're not going to be, unless you tell them they got to move, their first instinct is to hunker down. I've been around here 80 years. I've seen everything.
Not going anywhere, so.
Yeah, right. And these people tend to be very independent when they get to that age, and and set in their ways.
Very set in their ways.
So
I'm related to a couple of them.
I am too. We all are. Maybe we are some of them. Who knows? Anyhow, we touched on the topic of climate change, right? And you mentioned storms are doing this, or are they doing this? Where's it going in the future? The predictions? Like the one thing here, being on an island again, it comes back to sea level rise, right? What kind of handle? What are we predicting for the next 30, 40, 50 years? Probably after we're retired, and maybe someplace else even besides retired at that point. What's in store? What's the crystal ball telling us?
well, we're talking about significant sea level rise. We're talking, I think in the next 50 years, we're talking something like 30 inches. That's, that's
2.5 feet.
Yeah, that puts it over most bulkheads on a consistent basis. We're seeing, the ramifications we're seeing of it right now are low-lying areas that used to flood maybe a few times a year or every month on a full moon tide. They're now flooding more frequently. So it's not like all of a sudden you go out there and you see, oh my goodness, I'm under 2 feet of water. It's just you get more frequent flooding than you did in the past. Have these king tides all of a sudden become an issue. Broad Channel in Queens, they actually raised the road, raised the sanitary systems, raised all the infrastructure, and encouraged and pretty much forced the homeowners to raise their houses so that they were up above the road, so you didn't have to. It's really disconcerting to walk down from the road to your house in a low-lying area. So, so those people raise their houses.
Anytime it rains.
So they get the message. So you're going to see things like that happening. Long term, no one really knows what it's going to be. We're planning out 50 years and trying to make designs that way. We're also looking at those projections. There's a wide range of projections, and you say, okay, we know it's going to be somewhere in here, and then start looking at the economics of it and say, we really can't design reasonably to this high-end projection. So let's design to something a little less than that. Projection that's maybe we feel is more reasonable, but based upon our experience, we think it's reasonable, but it may not be reasonable in the future. But we're trying to balance the economic aspect with what we see for the future. And it's not easy.
Hopefully, all these efforts to reduce the human aspect of impact on climate change, reducing the carbon footprint, will start to have an impact. And, at
see
least
that
level
bend
that
the curve.
portion of- Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we saw the drop in the carbon emissions during the pandemic.
Yeah,
Lockdown,
that's right.
Globally, we saw a drop.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, I'm not going to say it can't be done. It certainly can be done, but that was an extreme situation. But you're right. Switching over to electrification of vehicles, fewer emissions that way. Even with your home, not burning fossil fuels to heat and cool that. There's a whole bunch of things that can be done. But before it was climate change, it was global warming, right? Are we still seeing a rise in global temperatures? I mean, as a surfer, I've seen the ocean be a little bit warmer in some years than it has in others. Just little things like that tip me off.
Yeah, today's Newsday, I think, had an article on exactly that, and it says, scientists are saying the tipping point is 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, and I think we're at like 1.1 or something like that, 1.2 now, and they think we're going to pass that in 2030.
Wow.
So it's incumbent upon us to try and to bend that curve some. I was on a webinar with New York City DEP this morning, and they're talking about getting themselves to zero emissions, carbon emissions, by 2050, I think it was. Using energy from the wastewater treatment plants, generating gas with the sludge reactors, taking heat out of the water.
Wastewater.
That we had talked about quite a bit over the last few years and had been talking to them about. And they take pride in their New York City water supply system because it's all gravity, and they're actually using hydro coming over those dams to generate power that's carbon-free power. So they're trying very hard to reduce their carbon emissions.
So, another aspect is, we see out west right now, there's a lot of wildfires, a lot of drought, which some people claim, could be attributed to climate change again. Don't really see that here in like the Northeast, but do you guys see anything else in terms of, increasing rainfall or aspects like that we may have to deal with in the future?
DEC is projecting a 20% increase in rainfall in New York State in the next, I think,
so I mean, just
30 years
think
or
of
something
our
like that, as a result of the global warming and climate change. Whether it makes any, just looking at one data point right now, the New York City reservoirs are 8% over their normal capacity at this time. And I think we're at above normal as far as rainfall this year. Or are we maxing out compared to what we'd seen in the past? I don't think so. But we have, and in the last few years, though, we've had some negative years too. So it's hard to look at one data point.
But it's those years when we have more, as the engineers that have to design some of the infrastructure, like for drainage, we got to collect the stuff, we got to convey it, we have to store it and recharge it or discharge it, you start getting 20% more on average, and you look at the systems, and obviously we're designed for a certain size storm, but if those storms start to get exceeded more frequently too, it goes back to more frequent flooding,
and we've looked at, some of the work we've done at the hospitals. They were subject to these microbursts where all of a sudden you get 8 inches of rainfall in
a couple hours,
which we never see here normally, and it just overwhelms the system.
Yep.
So, part of the design at Good Samaritan is to be able to withstand some of those microbursts and move the water off the property to recharge areas.
So, just kind of wrapping things up a little bit, in the grand scheme of things, how do we put all these pieces of the puzzle together to make the region and Long Island more resilient? All right. Again, I know money is certainly one of them. Funding, whether it comes from grants or it comes from the federal government or it comes from the taxpayer, ratepayer, whatever. But where do we start? What's got to be the priority, and how long is this going to take? And by the time we get done with it all, is it going to be so far different that what we just did doesn't make a difference anymore?
The decision makers have to look at it very carefully and not have knee-jerk reactions, which is something that's very tempting to people. And then you're not going to be able to protect for everything at once or everything ever. But so you do it a little at a time, and the most important areas, like Paul said, water supply, hospitals, water treatment, sewage treatment.
Yeah. Ultimately, there should be some regional thought to the thing. New York City's looking at the big U down at the bottom of Manhattan to protect,
Lower Manhattan.
Lower Manhattan. Should we be looking at floodgates on Fire Island and Jones Inlet and things to limit flow during those periods? Possibly. It protects a large area. You're not going, either you're going to raise everyone's homes up, and then you may have to raise them up again as this sea level keeps rising.
Oh, my God.
Or you've got to start looking at it regionally. Critical infrastructure is quick, and it protects us for the near term. Long term, you're going to have to look at other things, particularly if it just continues to go up. Everyone's going to be looking to Holland, to where they've lived with this for hundreds of years, and they know all about dikes and controlling water and managing it, and you're tens of miles from the shoreline, and there's a field there, and all of a sudden you see this boat going through the field because they have very low-lying areas and they know how to manage it.
And you said that before also, and it certainly has been discussed here. The concept of massive floodgates, the Corps of Engineers talked about it as early as the early 70s. They went to public hearings for work they were planning in Coney Island at the time. There's opposition, and as well as it being costly. And so the decision makers, the elected officials, really have to have the stomach to stand up and say, this is what needs to be done. Follow the advice of engineers, but I don't think we're going to see it happen. Is my answer.
It's nice when they do listen. That's for sure. All right, so I have one more question. It's maybe getting on the personal side of things, because you guys have mentioned it many times on the podcast. I love to be out in the water, in the ocean, and I've been reading articles lately by NASA about this moon wobble. Right? Have you guys heard about this? In like 10 years from now, the moon's going to be in this phase where you get that wobble where it creates higher high tides. Oh, yeah. All right, so cities like Miami, you mentioned Venice in Italy, and certainly Lower Manhattan in New York, and maybe even our barrier beaches are going to start to see these higher high tides. Is there anything we can do now, 10 years in advance, to prepare for something like that? Or is this just, wait and see? Or what? I mean, this is just, something that I've been reading a little bit about. And I found it very interesting. And, obviously I'll be 10 years older from now if I'm still around. And maybe in a different part of my life, and it won't matter. But right now it sure does.
I got to tell you, you read different things than I do. I haven't seen or heard about that. I'll defer to Paul.
I saw the headline on the moon wobble, but I didn't read the article. If it starts, I don't know,
it's all right. Maybe I'm getting into my mystic side here or something. I don't know, but it was interesting. just higher high tides, and that has just because of the phase of the moon, and this happens in cycles, like every 10, 20, 30 years. And we'll get lower low tides when it's out of that. So, but as a surfer, we normally don't like the high tide. Okay.
Well, right now I don't like the low tides.
As a boater, you don't like the low tide. I get it. We're at odds. All right. Well, guys, any closing thoughts on resiliency before we wrap up for today?
No, I think everyone's got to keep an open mind, both the engineers, the planners, and the public.
And the public, for sure, yeah.
It's a cooperative effort and a collaborative effort. Planning and engineering and economics and finance all come together with this, and it's got to be well thought out on all fronts. You can't have something that fails in an engineering sense, it won't work. Can't fail socially either, because if people don't evacuate, if don't follow the plan, whatever you design isn't going to work. It's not going to serve the purpose of saving people's lives.
As I said, it wasn't the plan that failed, but the failure to plan.
There we go.
Well said, Paul. Thank you. I want to thank both of you today, Dr. Paul Grosser, our Executive Chairman of the Board of Directors at PW Grosser, and Charlie Bartha, Senior Vice President of our Engineering Unit at PW Grosser. Again, I'm Paul Boyce, the host and President and CEO of PW Grosser. To our listeners, again, if you guys have any comments or suggestions or questions, feel free to reach out to us at our website, which is www.pwgrosser.com/podcast. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this very interesting and important topic of resiliency today. And again, it's been a pleasure. Take care.